What starts as a simple night on the porch, just a woman returning home to care for her family quickly, turns into something far more dangerous. When a violent gang sets their sights on her, thinking she's just another easy target, they make the mistake of their lives. Because she's not just another woman, she's a warrior, a fighter, a United States Navy SEAL trained to face the kind of danger these men can't even imagine. What happens next? It's a storm of betrayal, intimidation, and a community waking up after years of silence. You're about to witness a fight for justice that'll have you holding your breath until the very end. And trust me, you won't believe how this one ends. Before we dive in, let us know down in the comments, what time are you listening, and where in the world are you tuning in from? We love hearing from all of you, so don't be shy. Let's get into it. The sound of tires crunching along the gravel driveway broke the stillness of Brooksville, Tennessee. Alyssa Freeman leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel of her old black Jeep, staring up at the weathered house she hadn't seen since she was 10 years old. It looked smaller now. Or maybe it was just that she had grown so much since then, grown into someone her younger self never could have imagined. A United States Navy SEAL, fresh out of service after nearly a decade of deployment. She had seen war zones, faced the worst humanity had to offer, and yet, somehow, this small southern town made her feel more on edge than any battlefield ever had. She turned the engine off and sat there for a moment, breathing in the heavy silence. Her grandfather had passed 6 months ago. She hadn't been able to come back for the funeral too far, too late, stuck on assignment overseas. But now that her service was over, there were no more excuses. The old man had left her the house in his will, an empty, aging home on the edge of a town she barely remembered. It was hers now. Like it or not, she climbed out of the Jeep, stretching her back as she glanced up and down the quiet street. A few neighbors peeked out from their windows, squinting as if trying to place who she was. She could almost feel their questions hanging in the air. Who's that girl? What's she doing here? Another outsider? Alyssa knew the look all too well. She'd seen it in towns just like this around the country. A black woman showing up where folks didn't expect her. In uniform, she was respected. Out of uniform, she was just another face to judge. She grabbed her duffel bag and slammed the door shut behind her, forcing herself to shake off the nerves tightening in her chest. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to clear out the house, sign some papers, and get back to something that felt like home wherever that was now. Inside, the air was stale with dust and memories. Framed photos of her grandfather lined the wall-sold black-and-white pictures from his days as a young soldier, standing tall and proud in his World War II uniform. Alyssa ran her fingers over one of the frames, a small smile tugging at her lips. He used to tell her stories about standing up to bullies when he was younger, about how no one was going to push him off his land, no matter who they were or what they thought of him. That fire, she guessed it must have passed down to her somehow. She set her bag on the old recliner and glanced out the window again. 2 men stood near the corner of the block now, leaning on their motorcycles. They hadn't been there a moment ago. Alyssa narrowed her eyes. Black leather vests, heavy boots. She didn't need to get any closer to recognize the kind of crew they belonged to. The patch on their backs confirmed it, Widow's Son's Motorcycle Club. She had heard whispers about them even before she got here. Locals back in Nashville had warned her. Stay out of Brooksville, they'd said. That town's run by a crew of self-proclaimed enforcers who don't take kindly to strangers, especially black ones. Alyssa exhaled slowly, forcing her shoulders to relax. She wasn't about to start jumping at shadows. Not yet. Maybe they were just passing through. Maybe they hadn't even noticed her, but she knew better than to believe in maybes. She spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through dusty boxes in the living room, fighting back the flood of old memories. Every creak of the floor, every knock of the old pipes made her ears twitch. Years of training had wired her that way, hyper-aware, always listening. But nothing felt quite as unsettling as the weight of unseen eyes. By sunset, she finally decided to step outside, needing air, needing to stretch her legs. She grabbed her jacket, locked the door behind her, and started walking toward the old Veterans Park at the end of the street. Just a quiet stroll, she told herself. A chance to breathe, to settle her nerves. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink as the sun dipped low, but as she crossed the street, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't walking alone anymore. And she was right. Alyssa walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk, her boots scuffing the edge of the curb with every step. Brooksville hadn't changed much, not in the ways that mattered. The same peeling street sign, the same sagging telephone wires, the same heavy silence hanging over everything like the air itself was holding its breath. The closer she got to the old Veterans Park, the more she could hear the faint hum of voices up ahead. Laughter, low and sharp, carried on the wind. Not the kind that comes from friends sharing a joke, but something meaner, something uglier. Alyssa's pace slowed as she rounded the corner, and there they were. 3 of them this time, sitting on the worn-down wooden picnic tables near the edge of the park. All of them in black leather vests marked with the same patch she had noticed earlier. Widows' sons. They were loud, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer from glass bottles, like they owned the place. One of them, a thick-necked man with a scruffy beard and mirrored sunglasses, pointed in her direction and leaned over to whisper something to the others. Alyssa kept walking, head high, shoulders square, like she didn't notice them at all. But she noticed. Oh, she noticed. And so did they. The laughter died down as she passed. She could feel their eyes digging into her back like knives. She kept her steps steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of looking back. But then, right on cue, it started. "Hey, sweetheart, where you headed all by yourself?" one of them called out. She ignored it. The second one spoke louder. "Hey, I'm talking to you. What, too good to say hello?" Still, Alyssa kept walking, jaw tightening. The third one let out a long whistle. "Look at her go. Bet she ain't from around here. City girl, thinking she's something special." Alyssa could feel her heart pounding, not from fear, but from restraint. Every muscle in her body tensed, screaming for her to turn around and shut them down. But she knew better. Picking a fight on the street wouldn't win her anything but more trouble. She reached the park bench at the far side of the field, the same one she used to sit on as a little girl when her grandfather brought her here. It felt different now, colder somehow. She sat down slowly, forcing herself to breathe. For a moment, she thought maybe they'd lose interest, maybe they'd go back to whatever they were doing before. But they didn't. Their boots crunched on the gravel path behind her as they started walking, slow and deliberate, toward where she sat. Alyssa's body tensed again. She could hear their footsteps getting closer. She rested her arm casually along the back of the bench, pretending to be relaxed, but her mind was already calculating. 3 men. Medium build. Beer on their breath. False confidence in their swagger. She could take them if she had to. The man with the mirrored sunglasses stepped around in front of her, blocking her view of the field. His buddies flanked him, spreading out like they were closing in on a cornered animal. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, leaning in just a little too close. "City girls got nothing to say after all." Alyssa looked up slowly, locking eyes with her reflection in his glasses. She said nothing. "Aw, come on now," another one chimed in. "We're just being friendly. You new around here? Maybe you need a little welcome committee." That got a chuckle out of all 3 of them. Alyssa leaned back just a little more, crossing her arms over her chest like she had all the time in the world. "I'm just minding my own business," she said quietly. "Maybe you should try the same." The air shifted. The smiles faded. The leader's face twitched with irritation. He leaned in even closer. So close, she could smell the cheap beer and tobacco on his breath. "You got a mouth on you, girl," he whispered low and mean. "But let me tell you how things work around here. People like you keep your head down, you stay quiet, you don't come strutting into our town like you own it." Alyssa's lips twitched into the smallest of smirks. "People like me?" she repeated softly. That set him off. His fists clenched at his sides as he straightened up, towering over her. "Yeah, people like you," he snapped. "Now why don't you stand up and apologize for being so damn rude?" Alyssa didn't move, not yet. She kept her gaze steady, measuring the distance between them, waiting, listening, feeling the tension stretch tighter and tighter like a wire ready to snap. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. A 4th man had appeared, stepping off one of the parked bikes nearby, taller than the rest, heavier, his long hair tied back under a bandana. His leather vest had more patches than the others. and stitched in bold red letters across his back VP, Vice President. Alyssa's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a couple of low-level bullies looking for trouble. This was organized, planned. These guys weren't letting this go. She leaned forward slowly, resting her elbows on her knees, staring up at the man in front of her. "You don't want to do this," she warned, her voice low but sharp as steel. The leader let out a dry laugh and glanced back at his crew. "Oh, I think we do." Alyssa knew the moment had arrived. She could feel it in the way the air thickened, in the tightening fists of the man standing over her, and in the suffocating silence that seemed to swallow the entire park. Somewhere deep down, she'd hoped these men would get bored, that they'd just laugh her off and move on. But now, with the arrival of that fourth man, the vice president of the widow's sons, Alyssa knew that wasn't going to happen. Not tonight, not here. The leader in the mirrored sunglasses cracked his knuckles slowly, never taking his eyes off her. His two buddies shifted in place like restless dogs waiting for a command. The vice president stood a few feet back, arms crossed, silently watching like a man evaluating a new recruit. "You deaf or something?" the leader hissed, taking another step closer. "I told you to stand up and show some respect." Alyssa didn't move. She kept her body relaxed, almost casual. Years of training had drilled that into her. Never let them see you tense. Never let them read your fear. But her mind was moving a mile a minute. 4 of them. No weapons in sight, but that didn't mean they didn't have some stash nearby. And even if they didn't, 4 against 1 was never a smart fight. But she couldn't afford to back down. Not here, not like this. She let out a long breath and slowly stood to her feet, rising to face the man who had been barking in her face since she sat down. He was bigger than she was, sure. Taller, heavier. But his movements, they were sloppy. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his feet shuffled, he was relying on intimidation, not skill. And that made him predictable. Dangerous? Yes. But predictable. "I'm going to give you one more chance to turn around and walk away," Alyssa said, her voice low and steady. The man's face twisted into a sneer. He leaned in so close she could feel his breath on her cheek. "Or what?" he whispered. Alyssa's jaw tightened. She could feel the fight rising in her chest, like a spark catching dry brush. She didn't want this. God, she didn't want this. But they weren't giving her a choice. "I'm serious," she warned again. But the man just laughed. "You got nothing, girl. Nothing but a big mouth and a pretty face." That was it. Before the words had even finished leaving his lips, Alyssa moved. Fast, fluid, like a storm breaking loose. Her right hand shot up, grabbing the front of his vest and yanking him forward, while her left elbow slammed upward into his jaw. The impact snapped his head back, and the beer bottle he had been holding slipped from his fingers, shattering on the ground. The 2 men flanking him lunged in immediately, but Alyssa was already moving. She pivoted on her heel, driving her shoulder into the chest of the nearest one, sending him stumbling back into the picnic table. The other one swung wildly at her, but she ducked low, grabbing his wrist and twisting until he howled in pain, dropping to his knees. The leader recovered quickly, wiping blood from his mouth as rage twisted across his face. He charged at her like a freight train. Alyssa sidestepped at the last second, letting his own momentum carry him forward. She grabbed the back of his vest again and drove her knee into his lower back, sending him sprawling face first into the dirt. The vice president finally moved. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look nearly as sloppy as the others. No, this one moved like a man who'd seen real fights before. Alyssa squared her shoulders, keeping her feet planted. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You got a name, girl?" the VP asked, his voice low and dangerous. Alyssa narrowed her eyes. "Yeah," she replied, "but you don't need to know it." The man chuckled darkly, rolling his neck like he was warming up for a heavyweight match. "You got some moves, I'll give you that, but this ain't over, not even close." Behind him, the other 3 men were slowly pulling themselves up from the ground, groaning and cursing under their breath. Blood smeared the leader's mouth, and the one with the twisted wrist cradled his arm like it was broken. But none of them looked ready to back down. And then Alyssa heard it. A whistle, sharp, loud. From across the street, she glanced up, just in time to see 2 more men stepping off their motorcycles. Reinforcements. The VP smirked as he watched her eyes flick toward them. "Thought you had us all figured out, didn't you?" he taunted. "See, the thing about Brooksville is, you're never really alone. Not here." Alyssa's mind raced. She could probably drop a few more of them, but not all. Not with backup rolling in. She needed to move. Now, without another word, she took 2 quick steps back, turned on her heel, and started walking toward the park's exit. She didn't run. Running would only feed their egos. But she didn't slow down either. The men laughed behind her, taunting her as she walked away. She could hear their words, every filthy, hateful syllable. But she didn't look back. Not once. Not until she reached the edge of the park, where she ducked behind a tree and pulled out her phone, dialing the only number she knew she could trust. Lydia Palmer answered on the second ring. "Alyssa? What's wrong?" Alyssa's voice was tight, controlled, but burning with fury. "They just made their first mistake," she whispered, and she was just getting started. The next afternoon, Alyssa returned to the park. She told herself it was just to clear her head, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She came back because she knew they'd be waiting. She knew they wouldn't let it go, not after last night. Men like that never did. She had spent half the night replaying every second of that encounter in her head, every move, every word. And the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Not because she was scared, no. She had faced men twice as dangerous on battlefields halfway across the world. What gnawed at her was the memory of those faces in the windows. The people who saw everything and still did nothing. Brooksville wasn't just afraid, it was controlled, owned, and everyone in town knew exactly who owned it: the widow's sons. Sure enough, they were already there when she arrived. 6 of them this time, sitting on the same picnic tables like they'd never left. The leader still nursing a split lip from the elbow she'd planted in his face stood when he saw her. His pride had taken a hit last night, and from the look in his eyes, he wasn't planning on letting it slide. The vice president wasn't far behind, leaning casually on his bike, watching like a man who already knew how this was going to end. Alyssa didn't flinch. She didn't change course. She walked straight toward the bench again, just like before, like she had nothing to prove. But this time, she wasn't alone. Sheriff Clay Devers was already pulling up in his cruiser at the far end of the park. The men stiffened slightly when they saw the flashing lights, but none of them moved. None of them looked concerned. Alyssa watched as the sheriff climbed out of the car, casually adjusting his belt like he had all the time in the world. And that's when it hit her: he wasn't here to stop them. He was here to control her. Sheriff Devers tipped his hat as he approached, his eyes never leaving Alyssa's face. "Afternoon, ma'am," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We got a report about a little scuffle here last night. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Alyssa crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Yeah," she said evenly. "I know exactly what happened." The sheriff gave her a slow, patronizing smile. "Do tell." "They cornered me," she replied, nodding toward the gang. "They threatened me. I defended myself. That's what happened." Devers chuckled under his breath like she'd just told him a bedtime story. He turned to the gang, spreading his arms wide like they were old friends. "That true, boys? Y'all causing trouble again?" The leader still wiping his busted liplet out a dry laugh. "Just a misunderstanding, Sheriff. We were having a little chat. She got all jumpy, started swinging." Devers turned back to Alyssa, his expression shifting to something colder. "Sounds to me like you might be the one stirring things up, ma'am." Alyssa felt the blood rush to her face. "You've got to be kidding me." "No, ma'am, I'm not," the sheriff replied, stepping closer. His voice dropped to a warning whisper. "See folks around here, they don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and making waves, especially not the kind of waves you're making." Alyssa took a step forward, refusing to back down. "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" Devers let out a slow breath, glancing back toward the gang, who were watching with smug satisfaction. He leaned in just a little closer. "It's advice," he whispered. "Pack up. Head back to wherever you came from. You'll sleep a lot better that way." Alyssa's fists clenched at her sides. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger, and if she lost control now, they'd win. Without another word, she turned on her heel and started walking back toward her jeep. She could hear the laughter behind her. The sheriff didn't stop them. He didn't even pretend to care. As she reached the edge of the park, she glanced back one last time. Sheriff Devers was leaning against his cruiser, arms crossed, watching her like a man who thought he'd just won. But he hadn't, not even close. Alyssa climbed into her Jeep, gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. She took a deep breath, trying to shake the fury rattling in her chest. But the truth was, she didn't want to shake it. She wanted to hold on to it, let it burn, let it fuel her, because now she knew exactly what she was up against. She wasn't just fighting a gang of bullies, she was fighting a system that had protected them for years, and she wasn't going anywhere. It only took one night for the entire town to know exactly who she was. Alyssa didn't even have to say it herself. The news traveled faster than wildfire on a dry Tennessee summer day. She wasn't sure how it got out, but by morning, her phone was buzzing with a message from Lydia Palmertha, same reporter who'd been covering Brooksville for years. Lydia wasn't just any journalist. She was the kind who poked the hornet's nest and didn't flinch when she got stung. Alyssa knew that reputation all too well, but she didn't expect Lydia to show up on her front porch the very next morning. Alyssa stood in the doorway, staring at the woman holding a small notepad and phone recorder. "I'm not giving a statement," Alyssa said flatly. Lydia gave her a look, like she'd heard that 100 times before. "I don't need one," she replied, holding up her phone. "I already know who you are. Alyssa Freeman, United States Navy SEAL, Bronze Star, multiple deployments. You've been hiding in plain sight." Alyssa's jaw tightened. "That's none of this town's business." Lydia took a step forward, lowering her voice. "It became this town's business the moment those men put their hands on you." Alyssa looked over Lydia's shoulder toward the street. No sign of the widow's sons this morning, but she knew better than to think they'd disappeared. They were watching, waiting, planning their next move. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Alyssa said. Lydia nodded. "Maybe not, but whether you like it or not, you already did. They underestimated you. Now they know they can't scare you like they scare everyone else. That makes you their biggest problem." Alyssa leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And what do you want? An exclusive? A headline?" Lydia shook her head. "I want people to stop pretending they don't know what's going on in this town. You being a SEAL, that's the first thing that's made folks sit up and pay attention in years." Alyssa sighed, knowing there was truth in every word. She hated the attention. But she hated silence even more. The kind of silence that let men like Viper run free. "Look," Lydia continued, stepping back toward the porch steps. "You don't have to give me an interview. But if you're smart, you'll stop trying to fight this alone, because they aren't finished with you, not by a long shot." With that, Lydia turned and walked back toward her car, leaving Alyssa standing in the doorway with her thoughts spinning faster than she could process. By noon, it was official. The story broke on Lydia's small but dedicated news blog. The headline was simple, but it carried weight like a punch to the gut. "Widow's sons target retired Navy SEAL in Brooksville." The comments section lit up almost instantly. Some people praised Alyssa for standing her ground. Others accused her of stirring up trouble. And some were darker. Threats, insults, the kind of bile people only spewed when they could hide behind a keyboard. Alyssa closed the page before reading too much. She knew better than to feed that kind of fire. But the damage was done. Her face, her name, her military record, it was all out there now. By nightfall, the retaliation came. Alyssa returned from a grocery run to find her grandfather's house had been hit. The front porch was covered in spray-painted slur-shateful words in red and black that burned into her chest like open flames. Dead animal parts, gutted and tossed across the steps, lay rotting in the humid air. And right in the center of it all, nailed to the front door, was a single piece of cardboard with 4 words scrawled in thick black marker. "Get out or else." Alyssa stood there for a long moment, her fists clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. She could feel the rage boiling inside her, but she didn't move. Not yet, not until she was sure no one was still watching. She turned slowly, scanning the street. Empty, silent, just like she expected. They wanted her scared. They wanted her gone, but all they did was prove exactly who they were, exactly what they were capable of. Alyssa walked back to her Jeep, grabbed her phone, and dialed Lydia's number. The reporter answered almost immediately. I saw the stories getting traction, Lydia said. What's going on? They hit the house, Alyssa replied through gritted teeth. They left me a message, Lydia cursed under her breath. I'm coming over. No, Alyssa snapped. Not yet. I need you to do something else. Lydia paused on the other end. What? Start digging, Alyssa said. I want everything you can find on these guys. Names, records, arrest reports, all of it. And I want to know exactly how long the sheriff's been covering for them. Lydia let out a slow breath. You're serious? Dead serious, Alyssa replied. I'm done waiting for them to make the next move. It's time I make mine. And this time, she wasn't pulling any punches. By morning, the whole street had been scrubbed clean. Alyssa didn't do it to protect herself. She did it for her grandfather. He had spent his entire life building a reputation in this town. A quiet man. A proud veteran. A pillar of the community, at least he used to be. Back when people had the courage to speak up. She wasn't about to let those cowards stain what little legacy he had left. But deep down, Alyssa knew it was pointless. The town had already chosen its side, whether they admitted it or not. She saw it in the way people crossed the street when she walked by. She heard it in the way conversations died when she entered a room. Even the old lady at the grocery store, someone who used to sell her and her grandpa homemade fudge when she was just a little girl, couldn't look her in the eye anymore. They all knew, and none of them wanted to be the next target. That's how fear works. It silences people long before fists ever have to fly. Still, Alyssa wasn't here to win hearts. She was here to expose the truth, and that meant keeping her head down just for now until she had something real to fight with. She spent the next 2 days watching, listening, taking mental notes of every face, every vehicle, every pair of eyes that seemed to linger just a little too long. The widow's sons were quiet, too quiet. They hadn't made another move since the attack on the house, but Alyssa knew better than to think they'd given up. They were waiting. And so was she. Lydia, on the other hand, was moving fast. She called Alyssa every few hours with updates, each one darker than the last. Arrest reports, court cases that had disappeared without explanation, complaints that had been lost in the system. All tied to the widow's sons, all tied to Sheriff Devers. None of it surprised Alyssa. But hearing it out loud, seeing it in black and white, that made it real. The more Lydia dug, the clearer the pattern became. The widow's sons had been running this town for years, and Devers? He wasn't just turning a blind eye. He was part of it. Alyssa paced the living room that night, phone pressed to her ear as Lydia read off the latest findings. They've been covering for these guys for over a decade, Lydia said. Every assault, every threat, every missing report, Devers made sure it never went anywhere. Alyssa rubbed her temple, feeling the weight of it all settle on her shoulders. And the town just let it happen. Lydia's voice dropped to a whisper. They were scared. Still are. But you're different. You hit them back. You made them bleed. People are watching you now. Alyssa let out a bitter laugh. Yeah? And most of them are just waiting for me to pack up and leave. Not all of them, Lydia replied quietly. I've had a few people reach out since I ran the story. People who've had run-ins with the widow's sons. People who want to talk, but they're scared. Alyssa stopped pacing. Can you get them to meet me? Lydia hesitated. Maybe, but if they're seen with you, they'll be next on the list. Alyssa shook her head. Not if we do it right, quiet, private, somewhere safe. Lydia was silent for a moment, thinking. I know a place. An old church on the edge of town. Been shut down for years. Nobody goes near it anymore. Alyssa nodded slowly, the plan forming in her mind. Set it up. The next night, Alyssa drove to the edge of Brooksville under the cover of darkness. She parked her Jeep behind the crumbling remains of a long-abandoned church, its wooden frame leaning like it was carrying the weight of every forgotten prayer ever whispered inside its walls. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and shards of colored glass from shattered stained windows crunched beneath her boots. One by one, they arrived. 5 of them, 3 men, 2 women, all of them worn down by years of fear, all of them carrying stories they'd never dared to speak out loud. They didn't know who Alyssa was, not really, but they knew what she'd done, and that was enough. She listened as they spoke, their voices trembling but determined, stories of threats, of harassment, of violence that never made the news, stories that sounded all too familiar, and with every word, Alyssa felt the anger rise again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of anger that made her want to fight with her fists. This was something deeper, sharper. They had the truth now, real people, real stories, real witnesses. It was time to do something with it. Because if Brooksville wasn't ready to stand up for itself, Alyssa was more than ready to stand up for them. The storm hit just after midnight, not the kind that rattles windows or shakes trees from their roots. No, this storm came on two wheels, engines rumbling low, tires grinding up the gravel like it was their personal war drum. Alyssa was already awake when the first headlight cut through the darkness outside her window. She had been expecting this. She had felt it building all day long, that thick, electric weight in the air, like something was coiling tighter and tighter, waiting to snap. She just hadn't known when it would come. Until now, she moved quickly but quietly through the house, flipping off lights as she went, keeping herself in the shadows. She grabbed her phone and checked the time. 12:17 a.m. Too late for anyone to be driving through this part of town. She crept toward the front window, careful not to let herself be seen. From the corner of the curtain, she saw them 6 bikes, parked right in front of her grandfather's house. Engines off, but the threat hung thick in the air. And then, they started walking toward the porch. Alyssa's jaw clenched. She knew this wasn't just another warning. This was personal now. They weren't just trying to scare her. They were making a move. She slipped to the back of the house, grabbed the old hunting shotgun her grandfather used to keep in the closet. It wasn't loaded, but they didn't need to know that. She wasn't planning to pull the trigger. She just needed to buy herself enough time. But before she could reach the door, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. They were in. She didn't hesitate. She kicked the back door open and sprinted around the side of the house, moving low, using the shadows to her advantage. From the front porch, she heard their boots stomping through the living room. She heard the crash of furniture tipping over, the sound of pictures being ripped off the walls. Alyssa's blood boiled. But she didn't rush in. Not yet. She crouched low by the corner of the house, pulling out her phone. She hit the number she'd saved just 2 days ago. Mason Grant, state police captain. The only man in law enforcement she trusted. He answered on the second ring. Freeman? His voice was sharp, like he already knew something was wrong. They're here, she whispered. 6 of them. They broke in. Hold tight, he ordered. My team's already close. I'm on my way. Alyssa ended the call and slid the phone back into her pocket. She tightened her grip on the shotgun and waited. She could hear them inside, laughing, taunting her even though they didn't know where she was. And then, one of them stepped back onto the porch. The same leader she'd dropped in the park, the one with the busted lip. He lit a cigarette, looking out into the dark like he owned the whole damn world. Alyssa's pulse quickened. She stood slowly, stepping out from the side of the house, shotgun aimed low but steady. His head snapped toward her, surprise flashing across his face. Well, well, he sneered, flicking the cigarette to the ground. Look who finally grew a backbone. Get out, Alyssa said coldly. The other men started pouring back out onto the porch behind him, grinning like hyenas. None of them looked worried. Not even a little. One of them laughed. What you gonna do, sweetheart? Shoot us? Alyssa's jaw tightened. You've got 30 seconds to get off this property. The leader took a step forward, hands raised mockingly. Or what? You gonna call the sheriff again? You really that dumb? Alyssa didn't answer, because that's when the sirens started, distant at first, but closing fast. The leader froze, his smug expression cracking. The rest of the crew started looking around, eyes darting like cornered rats. You hear that? Alyssa whispered. That's what happens when you push too far. The first squad car screeched to a stop at the end of the driveway. Then another. Then 2 more. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the house and the gang in blinding white. State police. Real backup. Mason Grant himself stepped out of the lead car, hand on his holstered weapon. Everybody on the ground. Now. His voice boomed across the yard. For a split second, Alyssa thought the gang might run. But the numbers were too strong, the lights too bright. The game was over, and they knew it. One by one, they dropped to their knees, hands raised. The leader locked eyes with Alyssa one last time, hatred burning behind his glare. "This ain't over," he hissed. Alyssa lowered the shotgun slowly, her voice steady as stone. "Yes, it is." For the first time since she'd arrived in Brooksville, Alyssa felt the weight lift if only for a moment. The widow's sons had been hauled off in handcuffs, their bikes left behind like scattered trash on the front lawn. Mason and his team worked fast, taking statements, snapping photos, collecting what little physical evidence they could. But Alyssa knew the real evidence wasn't in the broken glass or the overturned furniture. It was in the witnesses. The people who had seen the gang dragged away under bright lights and flashing sirens. People who, for once, saw that the so-called kings of this town weren't untouchable after all. But Alyssa wasn't celebrating yet, because deep down, she knew this was just the first domino to fall. Viper and his crew were the muscle butt. Every army had a general, and in Brooksville, that general wore a badge. Sheriff Clay Devers. Mason stayed behind with his team as Alyssa slipped back inside the house. It smelled like cigarette smoke and sweat, the air heavy with the stench of men who had no fear of consequences. She walked through the wreckage-broken frames, shredded cushions, memories trampled into the floorboards. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just stood there, staring at the mess, breathing steady. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Lydia. "I heard what happened," Lydia said, her voice tight. "I've been getting calls all night." Alyssa leaned against the counter, gripping the edge with white-knuckled fingers. "Let me guess. Some people are scared? I made it worse?" "No," Lydia replied. "Some people are asking what they can do to help." Alyssa let out a slow breath. She wasn't expecting that. "Word's out," Lydia continued. "Everyone in town knows they got arrested. People are talking about it. Loudly. For the first time in a long time." Alyssa closed her eyes for a moment, letting that sink in. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally cracked something open. But the feeling didn't last long. "They won't stay locked up for long," Alyssa said. "Not with Devers running interference." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "You think he'll try to bury this?" Alyssa opened her eyes and stared out the window toward the darkened street. "I know he will." Lydia sighed on the other end of the line. "I'll keep digging. There's got to be something that ties him to all of this." "There is," Alyssa whispered. "We just haven't found it yet." By the next morning, Mason confirmed what Alyssa already suspected. The widow's sons were being held, but it wouldn't last. Without enough hard evidence, without enough charges that could actually stick, they'd be out on bail by the end of the week, maybe sooner. And Devers? He was already spinning the story in his favor. The town's official statement hit the local news that afternoon. A misunderstanding, they called it. A property dispute. Sheriff Devers himself stood in front of the courthouse, smiling for the cameras, reassuring the public that everything was under control. Alyssa watched the broadcast in disgust. It was all a lie, every word of it. But the worst part? Some people believed him. Some people wanted to believe him. Because the truth was harder to face. But Alyssa had seen too much to back down now. She stood in the living room, looking at the wreckage one more time, before grabbing her keys and heading for the door. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew who she was looking for. Mason met her at the edge of town that night. He didn't ask questions. He just got in the passenger seat of her Jeep and gave her a look that said, "Let's finish this." They drove for miles, out past the city limits, to a quiet diner on the outskirts, a place where no one paid attention to who came and went. Mason had a contact there, someone who claimed to have dirt on Devers, someone who wasn't ready to go public but wasn't willing to stay silent anymore either. Alyssa parked in the far corner of the lot, scanning the dark windows. "You sure about this?" she asked. Mason nodded. "If anyone knows how deep this goes, it's him." They stepped inside, and Alyssa immediately spotted the man sitting alone in the corner booth. Mid-50s. Weathered face. Hands shaking as he lifted his coffee. A former deputy, Mason had told her. Someone who had walked away years ago, before things got this bad. Alyssa slid into the booth across from him, Mason following close behind. The man looked up, his eyes bloodshot but clear enough to recognize the weight of what he was about to say. "I used to work for him," the man muttered, glancing toward the door like someone might be listening. "I used to think he was just another politician, all talk. But I was wrong. He's the one who built this mess. Alyssa leaned in, her voice like steel. Then tell us how to tear it down. And the man did. What he told them next would change everything. The man's name was Roy Bennett. He'd served under Sheriff Devers for nearly 15 years, back when the department still had a shred of integrity. But as he talked, his voice low and lined with regret, Alyssa could tell he'd been carrying a burden for far too long. It didn't start with the widow's sons, he said, staring into his half-empty coffee cup like it held the truth he didn't want to say out loud. But they sure as hell finished what Devers started. He told them everything. How the sheriff had built his power not just through intimidation, but by trading favors, burying charges, and rewarding loyalty with silence. The widow's sons weren't just a local gang, they were Devers' private enforcers. They kept the wrong kind of people out of town and the right kind in fear. That was the deal. And Roy? He'd looked the other way for too long. They'd harass families, slash tires, break window shell, even rough people up in alleyways. Then Devers would sweep in, smile for the cameras, and say he was handling it. Roy muttered, his voice shaking. But he never filed the reports, just made them disappear. Mason sat back in the booth, his face grim. "Why are you telling us this now?" Roy didn't hesitate. "Because I saw what they did to her house. I saw how she stood up to them. And I knew, if someone like her couldn't get justice in this town, then no one could." Alyssa nodded slowly. "I need more than your guilt, Roy. I need proof." He pulled a flash drive from his jacket and slid it across the table. "I kept backups, old reports, complaint logs, internal memos, stuff I was ordered to delete, stuff I didn't." Alyssa took it without a word. Her fingers closed around it like it was a live wire. Roy looked up at her then, his eyes clear despite the years of silence. "You get that into the right hands, and you burn the whole rotten tree down." Back at her grandfather's house, Alyssa and Mason plugged the flash drive into her laptop and opened the first file. What they saw made their stomachs turn. Names, addresses, dates, case after case labeled closed, with no explanation. Assaults, vandalism, intimidation. Every single one either buried, dismissed, or reassigned. And all of it tied back to the same people, the widow's sons. At least a dozen complaints included detailed statements that had never been followed up on, victims who were never called back, evidence that had mysteriously vanished. And worst of all, Devers' signature, buried at the bottom of more than 20 internal memos authorizing the closure of open investigations with zero justification. It was a pattern. And now, it was a trail. Mason took a slow breath, rubbing his hands over his face. "We've got him." Alyssa stared at the screen, her jaw tight. "We're not done yet, because the next file on the drive wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. A series of emails between Devers and a local businessman named Carl Whitcomb. The name sounded familiar, and then it clicked. He was one of the biggest landowners in the county, owned several rental properties, controlled a lot of the town's development money, and just happened to be a major donor to Devers' last election campaign. In the emails, Whitcomb complained about undesirable tenants moving into one of his buildings. Devers replied 2 days later with a simple message. "Consider it handled." And then came the police report, an anonymous call reporting a fight at that address. No arrests made, no charges filed, but the family had moved out 3 days later. It was all there, a network of corruption, fear, and control hidden in plain sight. The next morning, Alyssa sat across from Lydia in the back room of the newspaper's office. Lydia's eyes scanned the files, her fingers shaking over the keyboard. This is enough to bury him," Lydia whispered. "If I publish this, the state'll be crawling all over this town by sundown." Alyssa didn't blink. "Then do it." But Lydia hesitated. "He's going to come after me." Alyssa's voice dropped to a calm, steely whisper. "Not if I make the first move." Later that night, Alyssa stood on the steps of the old town hall. In her hands was a stack of printed reports. Behind her, Lydia set up a small live stream, camera nothing fancy, but enough to reach every screen in Brooksville and beyond. She looked into the lens like it was the barrel of a gun. "My name is Alyssa Freeman. I served this country for over 10 years in the United States Navy. I fought in wars halfway across the world. But nothing prepared me for the kind of corruption I found here in my own backyard. She held up the flash drive. These files contain evidence of systemic abuse, racial targeting, and collusion between law enforcement and known criminal groups. Sheriff Clay Devers isn't just failing this town, he's poisoning it. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She was a soldier again, and this was her battlefield. Behind her, Lydia kept the stream rolling. Within minutes, the comments poured in, people watching from every corner of the state, some thanking her, others in shock, just a few finally ready to speak up. And somewhere across town, Sheriff Devers was watching too. His time was running out. Alyssa didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with nothing but the hum of the old refrigerator and the quiet ticking of the wall clock to keep her company. Every hour or so, her phone buzzed with another message. Some from strangers. Some from familiar names she hadn't heard in years. Most were short 2 or 3 words at most. Thank you. About time. Be careful. But the one that hit her the hardest came right before sunrise, a single text from Roy Bennett. He won't go quietly. She didn't need him to tell her that. She already knew. By the time the sun came up, Brooksville had changed. Not because justice had been served, not yet, but because the fear had started to crack. People who had never dared to speak before were finally stepping out of the shadows. Lydia's phone didn't stop ringing all morning. Victims, witnesses, former deputies, people with stories they had swallowed for years now, finally ready to tell them. Mason showed up at the house just after breakfast, looking more tense than Alyssa had ever seen him. "You started a war," he muttered as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Alyssa leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "I didn't start it. I just stopped pretending it wasn't already here." Mason ran a hand through his hair and dropped into one of the old kitchen chairs. "We've got reporters circling town. State investigators are on their way. And Devers? He's pissed." Alyssa didn't flinch. "Good." Mason looked up at her, something flickering in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "I don't think you understand. He's got nothing left to lose. That makes him dangerous." "He's always been dangerous," Alyssa shot back. "Yeah, but now he's desperate," Mason added. They both knew what that meant. The house wasn't safe anymore. By noon, Alyssa packed a small bag, just the essentials. She didn't say much. Neither did Mason. They both knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As they pulled away from the house, Alyssa glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The porch was empty, but she could feel the weight of every threat still hanging in the air. Mason drove them to Lydia's office. They had work tutorial work, the kind that didn't end with a viral video or a few angry comments online, the kind that tore down walls. Lydia had already set up shop in the back room. Maps, notes, printouts. A full-blown investigation spread across every surface. She barely looked up when they walked in. "I've got people in Nashville begging for interviews," she muttered, flipping through her notes. "But if you ask me, the only ones who matter are right here." Mason nodded. "We need every victim, every witness, on record." Lydia leaned back in her chair. "You know they're scared." Alyssa stepped forward, her voice firm. "They're already living in fear. If they don't speak now, when will they?" For the next 2 days, they worked around the clock. Interview after interview, story after story, each one worse than the last. A woman who had her car vandalized because she dared to rent her house to a black family. A local business owner who had been threatened with accidents if he didn't fire his Latina employees. A teenage boy who had been jumped by 3 grown men in a parking lot, his case buried before it ever reached a courtroom. And every single story tied back to the widow's sons, tied back to Devers. By the end of the second day, the file was thicker than Alyssa could have ever imagined. Victims, financial records, emails, witness statements. And every last page pointed to one thing: Brooksville wasn't just a broken town. It was a rigged game, and Devers had been holding the deck for years. Mason leaned over the table, staring at the mountain of evidence. "It's enough." Lydia looked up, her voice trembling just a little. "Enough to what?" Mason didn't blink. "Enough to bring in the feds." Alyssa felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just a local fight anymore. It had just gone federal. That night, they made the call. And the next morning, Brooksville woke up to the sound of sirens. But this time, they weren't coming for Alyssa. They were coming for Sheriff Clay Devers, and Alyssa was going to watch every second of it. The sun never really seemed to rise in Brooksville the next morning. It was the kind of cloudy, heavy day that felt like it was holding its breath. The kind that pressed against your skin, thick and slow, like something was about to break but hadn't yet. Alyssa stood at the window of Lydia's small office, staring out at the empty street, watching as the sky hung low over the town like a threat. Her phone buzzed again, another notification, another headline, another comment. People all over the state were sharing the video of her standing on the steps of Town Hall, exposing Devers and his crew. Some praised her as a hero, some called her a liar, and some sent warnings that chilled her blood. Maybe you should have kept your mouth shut. She's next. Better watch your back, Navy girl. Alyssa locked the phone and slid it into her pocket. She'd seen worse threats in war zones, but this felt different. This was personal. These people didn't just want her gone, they wanted her silenced. Mason walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, setting one on the table in front of her. He didn't say anything right away. They didn't need to speak to understand each other now. Both of them knew this wasn't just another fight. This was the moment they had been building toward, and it wasn't going to end quietly. Lydia was already back at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she updated the story with every new witness statement, every new piece of evidence that came in. People were talking more than she'd ever expected. But every word came with a cost. "They're scared," Lydia whispered, not looking up. "Every single one of them keeps asking the same thing. What happens if Devers walks?" Alyssa swallowed hard. She had no answer. Not yet. Mason leaned forward, his elbows on the table, staring at the pile of files they'd gathered. "We've got to lock this down. Get it to the state attorney. Make it official." Lydia nodded. "I'm already working on it, but they're going to push back hard. You know that, right?" Alyssa nodded. "Let them." Hours passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and whispered plans. By late afternoon, the office was filled with a small group of brave souls victims, witnesses, and even a couple of former officers who had finally decided they'd had enough. Alyssa stood before them all, laying out the truth in plain language. "We can't do this halfway," she told them. "If you're in all the way. This town deserves better. But it won't come easy." One by one, they nodded. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they were tired of being afraid. By nightfall, Alyssa knew what had to happen next. She would lead them to the state attorney's office the next morning. They would hand-deliver the evidence, make formal statements, and put their names on record. No more hiding, no more silence. She spent that night back at her grandfather's house, standing on the porch in the dark, staring out at the empty street one more time. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was the start of something bigger, something she never asked for, but something she was born ready to finish. The next morning, when they pulled up to the county courthouse with their stack of evidence, Alyssa could feel every eye in the parking lot turned toward her. But this time, she didn't look away, because this time, she wasn't standing alone. Alyssa had seen a lot of tense situations in her life. Combat zones, enemy territory, foreign streets where every glance could be a threat. But nothing felt quite like the weight sitting on her chest as she climbed the courthouse steps that morning. This was different. This was personal. This was homier, at least it used to be. Behind her, the small group of witnesses followed quietly. Some kept their heads down. Some glanced over their shoulders like they were waiting for someone to jump out and stop them. But no one did. Not yet. For the first time in years, they weren't just surviving in the shadows. They were stepping into the light. Alyssa had to believe that meant something. Mason led the way inside, carrying the thick folder of evidence they'd worked so hard to build. Lydia stayed close behind, documenting every step, every word, every face that turned to stare. She knew this wasn't just a legal move, it was a statement. The entire town was watching now, and she wanted to make sure none of it got lost or twisted. They reached the receptionist at the state attorney's office, and Mason leaned over the counter, his voice firm but calm. "We need to speak with the prosecutor. It's urgent." The woman glanced up, clearly sizing them up. But before she could respond, a man in a gray suit appeared in the hallway. Assistant District Attorney Mark Ellis. Alyssa recognized him from the news. Sharp dresser, reputation for being by the book, exactly the kind of man they needed. Ellis raised an eyebrow as he approached. "What's going on here?" Mason didn't hesitate. He held up the folder. "We've got evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving Sheriff Devers, the widow's sons, and multiple cases of obstruction of justice. Ellis's face tightened. He waved them into a conference room without another word. For the next hour, they laid it all out. The intimidation, the harassment, the cover-ups, the files Roy had saved, the witness statements, everything. Alyssa watched Ellis carefully as they spoke, trying to read him the way she'd been trained to read enemies in the field. But the man gave nothing away. When they finished, Ellis sat back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. "This is a hell of a file," he muttered. "It's the truth," Alyssa replied. He nodded slowly. "I don't doubt that, but you're up against a sitting sheriff with deep connections. If we go after him, it's not going to be quiet." Alyssa leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "We didn't come here for quiet. We came here for justice." Ellis let out a long breath, then stood. "Give me 24 hours. I need to verify this. Pull the right people in." Mason stood too. "We'll be ready." As they left the courthouse, Alyssa could feel the shift in the air again. People on the sidewalks were whispering, pointing. The story was spreading faster than they could control it now. But that was the point. You can't clean up a rotten system without dragging it all into the daylight first. Back at Lydia's office, they waited. The longest 24 hours of Alyssa's life. Every knock on the door made her stomach twist. Every car that passed by made her heart pound just a little faster. Then, just after noon the next day, Lydia's phone lit up. She answered, her face going pale as she listened. Alyssa stood up, her fists clenching at her sides. Lydia hung up slowly, turning to face them. "It's happening," she whispered. "The state's moving in, right now." Mason grabbed his keys without another word. Alyssa was already at the door. When they reached the sheriff's department, it was chaos. State police cruisers lined the street. Officers in tactical gear moved through the parking lot. News cameras were already rolling, reporters shouting over each other as they tried to get the story first. And there, in the center of it all, stood Sheriff Clay Devers. His face was bright red, spit flying from his mouth as he screamed at the officers surrounding him. "You have no idea who you're messing with. You're making a mistake." But the state troopers didn't flinch. They cuffed him right there on the courthouse steps, reading him his rights loud enough for the entire town to hear. Alyssa watched from across the street, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, it almost felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's story unfold. But it wasn't someone else's story, it was hers. Mason turned to her, a small grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You did it," Alyssa shook her head. "We did it." Lydia stepped up beside them, snapping photos with shaking hands. "This isn't over," she whispered. "Not until they're all held accountable." Alyssa nodded slowly. "Then we keep going." The town of Brooksville had been held hostage for far too long. But today, they'd taken the first real step toward freedom, and Alyssa Freeman wasn't going anywhere. If you asked Alyssa to describe the moment, she wouldn't say it felt like victory, not exactly. It felt unfinished. Messy, like tearing down a wall and realizing you'd only cleared one side of the battlefield. The sheriff was gone, yes. Devers had been dragged off in cuffs for the whole world to see. But the widow's sons, they were still out there. And Alyssa knew taking down a corrupt lawman was one thing. Breaking the grip of a street gang? That was something else entirely. The arrests had stirred up the entire county. Protesters gathered on one side of the courthouse steps, calling for justice. On the other side, Devers' supporters shouted back, claiming it was all a setup, that Alyssa was a liar, that outsiders had no right to come into their town and change their way of life. But Alyssa didn't come here to change the town. She came here to stop the cancer that had already eaten it from the inside. And that meant finishing what she started. The widow's sons didn't take Devers' arrest lying down. By the end of the week, every member who'd been detained during the raid at her grandfather's house was already out on bail. Viper himself had posted a cryptic video online, standing in front of a row of their motorcycles, flanked by his crew. He didn't name her, didn't have to. "We don't bow," he said, staring cold into the camera. "We don't break. We sure as hell don't run." Alyssa watched the video in Mason's office, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. He wasn't just talking to his crew, he was talking to her, daring her to come after them again. And she was going to. Mason paced the floor behind her, rubbing the back of his neck. "They're rallying," he muttered. "Every outlaw crew in the county is watching. You hit them again. It's gonna explode. Alyssa didn't turn around. Then let it. Mason let out a frustrated breath. You don't get it. These aren't street punks anymore. They've been recruiting, growing. They're getting backup from other chapters out of state. If you push now, it's not just gonna be a fight, it's gonna be a war. Alyssa finally turned, her voice razor sharp. It already is a war. Lydia barged in before Mason could respond, her face pale. Phone clutched in her hand. They hit another house, she whispered. A family that spoke to me last week. Their front porch was torched last night. Alyssa's stomach dropped. Are they okay? Lydia nodded. Yeah, but barely. Fire didn't spread far. But they're terrified. Alyssa grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. Mason stepped in front of her. What are you doing? I'm done waiting, she snapped. They want to send a message? Fine, let's send one back. But Mason didn't move. You're walking straight into a trap. Alyssa stopped, her fists trembling at her sides. I can't sit back and let them keep doing this. You won't be sitting back, Mason said, lowering his voice. But you will be walking into that with backup. She narrowed her eyes. What kind of backup? Mason grabbed his phone and started dialing. The kind that doesn't wear widow's sons patches, and the kind that doesn't answer to divers. It took hours, but Mason's contacts came through. State police, federal agents. People who had been watching Brooksville quietly for months. Waiting for someone brave enough to light the fuse. And Alyssa? She was the fuse. They laid out the plan that night. A coordinated strike on the widow's son's clubhouse and old repair garage on the edge of town. Rumor had it they'd been stockpiling weapons there for months. Enough to arm every member in 3 counties. They'd hit them before dawn. No warning, no mercy. Alyssa sat with Mason and Lydia in the back of a surveillance van just a few blocks away, the hum of the engine barely covering the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. This is your last chance to sit this out, Mason whispered. But Alyssa didn't even blink. I didn't come this far to watch from the sidelines. When the signal came, the van doors flew open, and the team moved fast. Blacked-out SUVs surrounded the garage. Officers in tactical gear flooded the lot, shouting orders, weapons raised. Alyssa followed close behind, scanning every shadow, every doorway. And then, there they were. Viper and his crew, waiting. The moment they saw Alyssa step out from behind the officers, Viper's face twisted into something between a grin and a snarl. Well, well, he growled. Look who brought the cavalry. Alyssa didn't flinch. She stepped forward, standing at the edge of the floodlights. It's over, Viper laughed. Over? Lady, we're just getting started. One of the younger men reached for his waistband. But before he could move, Mason was already on him, tackling him to the ground. The rest of the officers surged forward, taking down the crew one by one. Viper didn't move. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at Alyssa like he was trying to burn a hole through her with his eyes. You think you win just because you've got a badge standing next to you now? He hissed. We own this town. Alyssa stepped closer, stopping just inches from his face. Not anymore, she whispered. Viper lunged, but the officers grabbed him first, slamming him face first into the hood of one of the SUVs, cuffing him tight. This time, there would be no bail, no sheriff to make the charges disappear. This time, they had the evidence, the weapons, the witness statements, everything they needed to bring down the entire operation. As Viper and his crew were loaded into the back of the SUVs, Alyssa finally let out the breath she'd been holding for what felt like weeks. Mason stepped up beside her, nodding toward the flashing lights. Looks like you started something they can't stop. Alyssa watched as the last SUV pulled away, carrying Viper into the night. And for the first time, it felt like something had finally shifted. Brooksville wasn't free yet, but it wasn't in the dark anymore. Alyssa stood on the courthouse steps again, just like she had days earlier. But this time, she wasn't the one being watched. She wasn't the story. Not today. Across the street, cameras flashed, and reporters shoved microphones toward the line of officers leading Viper and the rest of the widow's sons through the courthouse doors. This time, they weren't just facing charges for vandalism or intimidation. They were facing conspiracy charges, weapons trafficking, racketeering, enough to bury them for decades, if not life. And just like before, Viper didn't lower his head. He didn't cower. He didn't beg. He smiled. That snake-like grin Alyssa had come to recognize all too well. As the crowd pushed closer, Alyssa heard his voice rise above the noise. He turned, locking eyes with her one more time as the officers dragged him toward the courtroom. "You think you've won?" he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think they're gonna save you?" The crowd fell silent for just a breath. And in that moment, Alyssa understood exactly what he meant. He wasn't talking about his crew. He was talking about the town. Brooksville. The same people who had looked the other way for years. The same people who had let it all happen in the first place. Alyssa's jaw clenched as she watched him disappear into the building. She knew the trial would take weeks, months, even. But the real battle wasn't happening in that courtroom. It was happening right here, in the streets, in the living rooms, in the hearts and minds of every person who still wasn't sure which side they were on. Mason came to stand beside her, slipping his hands into his pockets. "He's not wrong, you know." Alyssa didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the courthouse doors. "Yeah, I know." Lydia approached from the sidewalk, a notebook in one hand and her phone in the other. "People are scared again," she whispered. "Not because of the widow's sons, not anymore. They're scared of what comes next." Alyssa turned to face her. "They should be." Lydia blinked, surprised. "Why?" Alyssa took a slow breath, her voice like steel. "Because they don't get to pretend they didn't know anymore. Not after everything we've shown them. Not after what we've done. The time for looking the other way is over." Mason nodded slowly. "You really think they're ready to face that?" Alyssa shrugged. "I don't know. But they're gonna have to." .com. Over the next few days, Brooksville seemed to teeter on the edge of something no one could quite define. People whispered in grocery stores. Church parking lots filled with long, uneasy silences. Even the local diners, usually buzzing with small-town gossip, felt tense. The sheriff was gone, the gang was locked up, and the people, they didn't know what to do with themselves. Some were relieved, some were furious, and some, well, some acted like nothing had changed at all. Alyssa felt it everywhere she went. Eyes on her back, doors that didn't open when she knocked, conversations that stopped the moment she stepped too close. But then, something happened. It started small. A handwritten note slipped under Lydia's office door. No name, no signature, just 2 words, scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Thank you." The next day, it happened again. This time, a bag of groceries left on Alyssa's porch with a note tucked inside. "For the fight you didn't have to take on, but did anyway." And then, one night, as Alyssa sat alone on that same worn porch, she heard footsteps on the gravel. She stood, ready for anything. But it wasn't trouble. It was an older woman, someone Alyssa recognized from the church she used to attend as a child. The woman stopped at the bottom of the steps, clutching her purse with shaking hands. I just wanted to say," the woman stammered, her voice barely louder than a whisper, "I'm sorry we didn't do more. We were scared." Alyssa swallowed hard, the lump in her throat catching her off guard. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I was scared too," Alyssa admitted. The woman nodded, tears filling her eyes. "But you did it anyway." Alyssa didn't sleep much that night. She sat on the porch until sunrise, staring out at the street, wondering how many more people were still waiting to find their voice. By the end of the week, more people started showing up, one by one. Quiet conversations on porches, nervous apologies in grocery store aisles. People who had once looked the other way, now asking what they could do to help. It wasn't a parade, it wasn't a celebration, but it was a start. Mason sat beside her on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip low behind the trees. "You're building something here," he muttered. Alyssa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm not building anything." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Could have fooled me." Alyssa shook her head. "They're the ones building it. I just knocked the first brick loose." Lydia showed up not long after, carrying a thick folder of court documents and press requests. She flopped into the chair next to them, letting out a long, tired sigh. "You're officially the most wanted interview in the state," Lydia teased. Alyssa let out a dry laugh. "Not interested," Lydia grinned. "Didn't think so." They sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of everything they'd done settling between them. It wasn't over, not even close. But for the first time, in a long time, It felt like maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone anymore. And that was worth fighting for. Alyssa had never sat on a witness bench before. She had sat in briefing rooms, sat on helicopters flying into foreign territory, sat behind barricades while gunfire cracked through the air. But this was different. This wasn't war in some faraway place. This wasn't some faceless enemy on foreign soil. This was Brooksville. This was home. And the enemy had worn familiar faces. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the judge call the court to order. The hum of people whispering behind her filled the room like static electricity. Some had shown up to see the widow's sons finally face consequences. Some had shown up hoping to see the whole thing fall apart. But most were just waiting to see who flinched first. When Viper was led into the courtroom in shackles, Alyssa watched his face carefully. No smirk this time, no cocky grin. He looked tired, hardened, like a man who knew his luck had finally run out. His crew followed, all of them stone-faced, refusing to look anywhere but at the floor. Across the aisle, Alyssa recognized the faces of the families who had spoken out, the ones who had once been too scared to say anything. Now, they were here, present, showing up when it mattered most. It wasn't just Alyssa's fight anymore. The prosecution laid out everything they had: evidence, witness statements, the weapons seized from the garage, the financial trail leading back to illegal activities. Every page of the case felt like another brick laid on top of Viper's shoulders, but the defense fought back harder than anyone expected. They leaned into the town's old habits, whispered about outsiders, stirring up trouble, tried to paint Alyssa as the one who escalated the situation, tried to shift blame to a misunderstanding, claiming that the widow's sons were just a group of men protecting their community. Alyssa bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted blood. She knew this tactic. She'd seen it before in every crooked system she'd ever tried to fight. Twist the truth, shift the blame, make the victim the problem. And yet, as the defense spoke, something strange started happening. People in the courtroom started shaking their heads, not in agreement, in disbelief. No one stood up. No one shouted them down. But Alyssa saw the looks, saw the way people started leaning toward each other, whispering in disgust, saw the way even the jurors glanced at one another, frowning deeper with every word the defense tried to spin. The town was finally seeing it. The lie was unraveling. When it was Alyssa's turn to testify, she stood slowly, walking to the front of the room like she was carrying the weight of the entire community on her back. And maybe she was. She took the oath, Saturday down, and when they asked her to speak, she didn't hold back. She told them everything about the threats, the attacks, the sheriff's betrayal. She told them about the fear that had gripped this town for years, about the people too scared to speak, about the people who had finally found the courage to stand up, and she made sure they knew why she had done it. "I didn't come here to tear this town apart," Alyssa said, her voice steady, echoing through the silent courtroom. "I came here because it was already broken. I came here because no one else would. I came here because I couldn't stand by and watch good people lose everything while cowards hid behind badges and leather jackets." The judge called for order as the gallery stirred. But Alyssa wasn't finished. "And if standing up for what's right makes me the enemy to some people in this room, then so be it. But I promise you this, if you let these men walk free, you're not just failing me. You're failing every person who's ever been too afraid to come here and tell their story." The courtroom sat in heavy silence as she stepped down, returning to her seat next to Lydia and Mason. Lydia reached over, squeezing her hand so tight Alyssa thought her fingers might go numb. The closing arguments felt like they lasted forever, but when the jury finally left to deliberate, Alyssa knew they'd heard what they needed to hear. Hours passed, the sun dipped low in the sky. The courthouse lights flickered as the town held its breath. And then, the doors opened. The jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "On the charges of conspiracy to commit acts of violence, we find the defendants guilty. On the charges of illegal weapons trafficking, guilty. On the charges of intimidation and harassment, guilty." One by one, the charges rolled out, every word like a hammer striking the ground. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." Alyssa felt her breath hitch in her throat. For the first time since this nightmare started, she allowed herself to exhale. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Some gasped. A few stood in stunned silence. Viper didn't flinch. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. But Alyssa didn't need him to. This wasn't his moment. It was the town's. It was every voice that had once been silenced. It was every person who had once believed nothing would ever change. And now, change was here. Mason leaned in close, whispering in her ear. "You did it." Alyssa shook her head slowly. "We did it." Lydia wiped a tear from her cheek, smiling for the first time in days. "And now, they can finally start healing." Alyssa nodded, standing as the judge announced sentencing would begin the following week. But she knew the real sentence had already been delivered. The town of Brooksville had finally stood up for itself, and nothing would ever be the same again. 1 week later, Alyssa sat on the porch of her grandfather's old house, the same porch where it all began. But this time, she wasn't sitting in the dark. This time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. This time, she wasn't waiting for the next threat to show up at her door. The town was quiet, peaceful, almost. But it wasn't the same silence that used to press down on this place like a weight no one could shake. No, this was different. This was a breath of something new. Something alive. Something that felt a little bit like hope. She leaned back in the old rocking chair, the wood creaking softly beneath her. She let her eyes drift to the yard, to the spot where those motorcycles had once lined up under the cover of night. That felt like a lifetime ago now. Viper had been sentenced earlier that morning, 25 years, without the possibility of parole. His crew had followed right behind him, each man facing sentences that would keep them locked away for years to come. And the sheriff? Clay Devers had taken a deal. But even that wouldn't keep him from spending at least a decade behind bars. His career was over. His reputation destroyed. Brooksville was finally free from their grip. And yet, Alyssa knew the work wasn't finished. It never really was. Taking down the leaders was only part of the fight. The real change, the lasting change, that would take time. It would take people who cared enough to keep pushing. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, she sipped from the chipped mug in her hands, the coffee inside long since gone cold. She didn't mind. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about the quiet. The moment, the space to finally breathe. Mason pulled up in his cruiser a few minutes later, stepping out and making his way up the steps without saying a word. He dropped into the chair next to her, letting out a long, heavy sigh. "Well," he muttered, "looks like they're already trying to figure out who's gonna run for sheriff next." Alyssa smirked, shaking her head. "Let me guess. A whole bunch of folks who swore they never knew Devers was dirty." Mason laughed under his breath. "You know it!" They sat there for a while, watching the sun dip low behind the trees. The town looked different in the evening light, less like a battlefield, more like a home. Lydia showed up not long after, parking her car at the curb and walking up with a stack of newspapers under her arm. She handed one to Alyssa without a word. The headline stretched across the front page in bold, black letters. "Brooksville cleans house. Community leaders finally face justice." Alyssa traced the words with her finger, feeling the weight of them settle in her chest. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. "They're gonna write stories about this for years," Lydia said softly, sitting on the steps below them. "Some people will remember it right. Some people won't. But you'll always know the truth." Alyssa nodded, folding the paper and setting it on the table beside her. "Out now. That's what matters." Lydia leaned back on her elbows, staring up at the darkening sky. "What about you? What's next?" Alyssa let the question hang in the air for a moment. She didn't really know. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She came here for one reason: to settle her grandfather's affairs. She never expected to tear the town wide open in the process. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I'll stick around. See if this place really wants to heal. Or if it's just waiting to go back to the way things were." Mason turned to her, a small grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I think they're ready, but they're gonna need someone to remind them not to fall asleep again." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "And you think I'm that someone?" Mason nodded without hesitation. "I do." Lydia smiled, pulling her knees to her chest. "I do too." Alyssa leaned back in the chair, letting their words settle in. She hadn't come here looking for purpose. She hadn't come here looking to lead. But maybe, just maybe, this was where she was meant to be. She stood slowly, stretching her arms above her head. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like something had finally shifted in the right direction. She looked out over the yard one last time, remembering her grandfather's words when she was a little girl. This land's yours, baby girl, but it's not just the land, it's the people, and sometimes you gotta fight for both. She smiled softly, blinking back the sting in her eyes. Yeah, he'd been right. Mason stood too, patting her on the back. Come on, he said. Let's get something to eat. I heard the diners finally got folks sitting together again. Alyssa grabbed her jacket, glancing back at the old house one last time. It wasn't finished. It never would be. But the fight, the fear, the silence, that part was over, and whatever came next, she was ready. Because Brooksville finally remembered how to stand up. And now, so did she. Sometimes, life doesn't give us a choice about the battles we face. Sometimes, trouble comes knocking whether we're ready or not. But what matters is how we choose to stand. You see, Alyssa didn't ask for a fight. She didn't come looking for a spotlight. She simply refused to sit back and watch good people get swallowed by fear. And maybe that's the lesson here. It's easy to believe that standing up won't make a difference. It's easy to convince ourselves that someone else will step in, that someone else will fix what's broken. But what if that someone is you? No matter how old we get, no matter where we are in life, it's never too late to take a stand. For what's right, for what's true, for the next generation that's still watching us to see how we carry the fight. Because courage doesn't come from not being afraid. Courage comes from standing up anyway, even when your voice shakes, even when you stand alone. And hey, if this story moved you, or if you believe in standing up for what's right, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. We'll see you next time.